Recently, the world's elite converged in Davos, Switzerland, for the World Economic Forum's annual meeting. You've likely already encountered its most widely shared, even sensational, moments. We saw Donald Trump verbally attacking Europe alongside his entourage, Emmanuel Macron seemingly boosting European stocks by donning luxury sunglasses, and ECB President Christine Lagarde candidly stating the need for a SWOT analysis of the European Union. However, beyond these attention-grabbing sound bites and the occasional Europe bashing, dozens of far more critical discussions unfolded, conversations you likely didn't hear about, especially since some panelists seemed keen to sidestep these topics entirely. That's precisely why today, we're dissecting the most significant, yet overlooked, aspects of this year's Davos summit and explaining their profound implications for both global markets and your daily life. My name is Nick, and you're watching Coinball Finance. First and foremost, it's crucial to understand that nothing in this video constitutes financial advice. This is purely educational content, designed to inform you about the true underlying narratives that emerged from the World Economic Forum's annual gathering. If this kind of insightful analysis is what you seek, please hit that like button to boost us in your algorithm, subscribe to the channel, and activate the notification bell so you won't miss our upcoming videos. Before we delve into the specifics of this year's Davos summit, a brief historical overview is essential. The World Economic Forum, often referred to as the WEF, is a non-governmental organization founded in 1971 by German engineer Klaus Schwab. Schwab served as the WEF's chairman until April 2025, when he reportedly resigned following allegations of sexual misconduct and workplace harassment, initially reported in 2024. Soon after, BlackRock CEO Larry Fink and Roche Holding Vice Chairman Andre Hoffman stepped in as interim co-chairs of the WEF. As many of you know, BlackRock stands as the world's largest asset manager, while Roche Holding is a major pharmaceutical company. What might not be immediately apparent, however, is that this leadership change is akin to the true power broker, previously operating behind the scenes, now stepping into the spotlight. You see, the WEF was originally conceived as a modest gathering for European business leaders to network and discuss commercial matters. Over the decades, however, the organization has dramatically evolved into a powerful platform where many of the world's most influential figures convene, actively striving to shape global affairs according to their own vision. More than that, it has become an incubator, actively fostering the development of the next generation of global power players. The most notorious illustration of this is the WEF's Young Global Leaders program, which identifies exceptionally promising young individuals worldwide and grooms them to become future presidents and CEOs. In a well-known 2017 interview at Harvard University, Klaus Schwab famously revealed that then German Chancellor Angela Merkel, then Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, and even Russian President Vladimir Putin were once alumni of the WEF's Young Global Leaders program. Unsurprisingly, this revelation has fueled serious concerns that the WEF wields substantial influence over national governments, potentially rendering the opinions and votes of citizens in most countries largely irrelevant. And its reach extends beyond politics. The WEF exerts significant influence over the global economy, primarily because its membership includes the world's most powerful corporations, with BlackRock standing as one of its most pivotal players. This context makes Larry Fink's appointment as interim co-chair of the WEF profoundly significant. In the grand scheme of things, Klaus Schwab was, arguably, merely a figurehead for the global elite. The individuals truly orchestrating events were figures like Fink, and his ascension to interim co-chair of the WEF could therefore be interpreted as the puppet master finally emerging from behind the curtain. A clear illustration of this dynamic, every one of the WEF's annual meetings in Davos adopts a specific theme. This year's theme was, a spirit of dialogue. Thus, one might humorously suggest that the puppet master has stepped forward, effectively asking, I understand many of you wish my puppet show would end, but could we not simply sit down and discuss everything? Interestingly enough, this sentiment almost perfectly encapsulates the opening remarks delivered at this year's WEF forum. And judging by the overwhelming reactions online, the global population's collective response was a resounding no. And by the way, if you're finding this video informative, you should definitely explore our free weekly newsletter and check out some of the exclusive finance-related offers we've curated specifically for our viewers. Simply click the link in the description or scan the QR code. You truly don't want to miss out on what we have available. Moving on, as I mentioned in the introduction, this year's Davos summit generated numerous viral moments, many of which frankly bordered on a literal clown show. What's particularly striking, however, is how conveniently these superficial sound bites appeared to divert attention from the truly grave discussions taking place at the WEF, some of which actually began long before the official annual meeting commenced. For context, the official annual meeting ran from Monday, January 19th, to Friday, January 23rd. Yet, if you examine the actual program for the summit, you'll discover that the first crucial panel discussion occurred much earlier, on January 8th, followed by a second on January 13th, and a third on January 14th. Typically, these preliminary panels are nothing burgers, devoid of substantive news. But this time, it was different. The first panel discussion was a press conference centered on the Global Cooperation Barometer, an annual report jointly published by the WEF and McKinsey, the renowned consulting firm. Predictably, the report indicated a decline in global cooperation. However, WEF CEO and President Borge Brende insisted that cooperation had, in fact, been increasing in specific areas, notably between the European Union and other jurisdictions like Latin America, and more recently, India. As far as we can discern, this selective narrative precisely explains the growing dissatisfaction with the EU in recent times. The EU is perceived by many as the embodiment of an unaccountable and quasi-unelected organization, progressively seeking to exert influence over people against their will, and consequently, increasingly losing favor. This trend was conspicuously evident at this year's Davos summit, where European elites consistently doubled down on their demonstrably failing strategies. And what's truly ironic is that one of the questions posed at the conclusion of that first panel discussion was quite literally, how will Europe survive the changing world order? Brende's response was, verbatim, exactly what I just highlighted, by stubbornly adhering to failing ideas, such as the EU assuming even greater control and influence over European nations. I would also be remiss if I didn't point out another recurring theme Brende reiterated across various panel discussions and speeches. He repeatedly emphasized the urgent need for global coordination to combat future pandemics and cyber attacks. For those familiar with the WEF, you might recall Klaus Schwab's past warning of a cyber pandemic, which would presumably provide the WEF and its constituents with the perfect pretext to centralize global control even further. As Winston Churchill famously quipped, never let a good crisis go to waste. Another key panelist on that initial discussion was Bob Sternfels from McKinsey, co-author of the aforementioned report. What's alarming is Sternfels' revelation that only 29% of businesses surveyed indicated they were capable of withstanding another exogenous shock, similar to the recent pandemic. This statistic becomes even more unsettling given Brende and his colleagues' apparent eagerness for the next crisis, whatever form it may take. But the most terrifying aspect is that the risk of an exogenous shock was a topic actively discussed on yet another WEF panel you likely missed. And by all indications, the probability of experiencing more exogenous shocks is objectively high. If Sternfels' findings are accurate, this implies that the world could be hurtling towards a global recession, a scenario many WEF panelists were markedly reluctant to discuss openly. This thread connects directly to the panel discussion held on January 13th, where Brende once again reiterated the necessity for global coordination to prepare for the next pandemic or cyber attack. He then made another statement he would repeat in subsequent panels and speeches, that the world is currently experiencing a 1945 moment. This assertion is questionable, as many argue the world is, in fact, closer to a 1929 moment, which infamously triggered the Great Depression and eventually World War II. But even that isn't the most alarming detail. The most alarming revelations came from WEF managing directors Marek Dusek and Sadia Zahidi, who spoke frankly about the global financial system. In essence, global debt has escalated to a point where it is now a significant concern among the WEF's constituents. Simultaneously, WEF members are deeply apprehensive about proliferating asset bubbles and the potential for exogenous shocks that could cause them to burst. And as we just learned from Sternfeld's research, a mere 29% of businesses would be able to withstand such a shock. This suggests that what's potentially on the horizon could be far more severe than a global recession. It could very well be a global depression. It's difficult to envision any other outcome. If a significant shock causes widespread business failures, market collapses, and universal debt defaults, a depression appears to be the inevitable conclusion. This brings us to the panel discussion from January 14th, which focused on the WEF's annual Global Risks Report. Unsurprisingly, the foremost risks identified by WEF members for 2026 include geoeconomic confrontation, state-based armed conflict, with extreme weather events ranking a distant third. Believe it or not, however, Zahidi, who also participated in this panel, issued a stark warning: inequality forms the nexus of these major risks. She elaborated that persistent inequality inevitably fuels populism, which in turn leads to policies that exacerbate economic confrontation and conflict. This further entrenches inequality, spiraling into even greater populism, creating a dangerous and self-perpetuating cycle. Naturally, Zahidi was directly asked if this trajectory could culminate in a global recession. She appeared visibly uncomfortable and refrained from directly answering yes. All she would concede was her concern regarding inflation and the escalating valuations of AI companies. It's crucial to remember that everything I've just recounted transpired before the Davos summit officially began. Collectively, these three pre-summit panel discussions strongly indicate that the WEF is deeply preoccupied with three primary concerns: spiraling global debt, particularly government debt, burgeoning asset bubbles, notably the AI tech bubble, and the imminent threat of exogenous shocks, especially those capable of crippling the economy and tanking financial markets. The WEF is also clearly troubled by the rise of populism, including the increasingly critical attitude of the average person towards the institution itself, a sentiment that is far from positive. As I mentioned earlier, Brand and Fink deliberately emphasized a spirit of dialogue in their opening statements on the first day, pledging to ensure that a broader range of voices would be heard, not just those of the global elite. To their credit, they might actually follow through. On the final day of the conference, Larry Fink posted on LinkedIn about the possibility that the WEF's annual summit might no longer be exclusively held in Davos. In the future, it could rotate among various cities, such as Dublin, Ireland, and Jakarta, Indonesia. However, this transition will be far easier said than done. The Davos summit demands an extraordinarily high level of security, provided by both military forces and police. We find it challenging to believe that the WEF would be able to adequately safeguard its constituents in less controlled environments, and it would become virtually impossible if populism continues its seemingly inevitable ascent. This brings us back to those three core concerns: unsustainable debt, asset bubbles, and exogenous shocks. Since it's impossible to comprehensively summarize every single panel discussion and speech in one video, we chose to focus specifically on those directly addressing these three critical issues, particularly any explicit comments made about them. We'll begin with the Global Economic Outlook panel, held on the final day of the Davos summit. IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva unequivocally confirmed that, yes, the risks of an exogenous shock are significantly higher now than they were just 1 year ago. Saudi Finance Minister Mohammed Al-Jadaan made a concerted effort to steer the discussion towards these shocks and other pressing concerns, notably the escalating debt problem. He went as far as to declare that everyone is currently distracted by the pervasive hype surrounding AI and fails to grasp the true magnitude of the debt crisis. To his credit, New York Times editor Andrew Ross Sorkin, who moderated the panel, also attempted to bring the discussion back to the concerns articulated by the WEF's own constituents. He directly questioned ECB President Christine Lagarde about the debt problem. Lo and behold, she promptly launched into a rambling discourse about AI instead, thereby validating Al-Jadaan's point in real time. everyone is indeed caught up in the AI hype and ignoring the fundamental issues. To add insult to injury, Lagarde also asserted that the WEF has a duty to truth and needs to build trust. For context, the Financial Times recently reported that Lagarde's actual pay package is 50% higher than what the ECB has officially disclosed. So, it's fair to say she's not exactly leading by example in the realm of transparency and trust. At least it's an improvement from last year, when she controversially suggested that Europeans needed to keep their savings at home to finance the EU's ideological agenda. In any case, you'll recall that two of the top risks highlighted by the WEF in its Global Risks Report are geopolitical in nature. Logically, this suggests that any impending exogenous shocks are themselves likely to have geopolitical origins. This directly relates to another panel discussion held on the final day, aptly titled Geopolitical Risks Outlook for 2026. Amidst what might have been perceived as general warmongering, some profound insights emerged. Cornell University professor Ishwar Prasad made a particularly fascinating observation. In the 1980s, Japan began to challenge the U.S. economically but ultimately did not succeed. Then, in the 2000s, Europe attempted a similar economic challenge, also without success. Prasad highlighted that today, China is presenting an economic challenge to the U.S. But he believes that this time, China could indeed succeed, primarily due to a fundamentally different strategic approach. This implies that any geopolitically related exogenous shocks are highly likely to involve China and the U.S., a scenario that many people are not currently contemplating. Most focus remains on regions like Ukraine, Iran, and Venezuela. Then again, one could argue that all these ongoing conflicts and tensions are, in essence, proxy wars between China and the U.S., with Taiwan representing a potential final showdown. Regardless, two panels specifically addressed the issue of debt, one focusing on global debt, and the other on private credit. We'll begin with the discussion on private credit, as it proved to be the most alarming. For those unfamiliar, private credit refers to lending activities that bypass traditional banks. For instance, if I lend you $50, that's technically a form of private credit. However, institutional private credit is far more complex and significantly less transparent. If you watched our previous video, linked here, about potential causes of the next financial crisis, you'll recall that private credit is a top contender, drawing disturbing parallels to the mortgage bubble of the early 2000s. Back then, mortgages were extended to individuals who were not truly creditworthy, enabling them to purchase homes. These mortgages were then bundled together and sold as mortgage-backed securities, which were widely, and falsely, assumed to be safe investments. Today, private credit involves lending money to high-risk businesses, then bundling these credits together and marketing them as safe investments. Just like with mortgage-backed securities, no one truly knows the exact identities of the borrowers, the specific lending conditions, or who exactly is investing in these intricate financial instruments. This opacity makes it incredibly challenging for governments and central banks to pinpoint and rectify any emerging problems. Bain & Company managing partner Christophe Dassault initiated the private credit discussion by explaining its rapid growth since post-2008 regulations imposed limits on traditional bank lending activities, a dynamic we thoroughly explored in our earlier video. S&P Global President and CEO Martina Chung then revealed that the largest growth areas for private credit are no longer primarily in North America, but have shifted to Europe and other international regions. Joe Taylor, the president and CEO of the Ontario Teachers' Pension Plan, was noted as one of the significant buyers of this debt, which is particularly disquieting if you follow financial headlines. For those unaware, the Ontario Teachers' Pension Plan famously invested in FTX, the cryptocurrency exchange that ultimately unraveled as a colossal Ponzi scheme. Teachers in the Canadian province of Ontario lost nearly $100 million when FTX collapsed. As you might have surmised, Joe Taylor was the president and CEO at that time, making it highly probable he approved that ill-fated deal. Now, he's back at it again, directing the pension funds of teachers into another opaque and increasingly risky asset class. As you can undoubtedly imagine, Joe Taylor became highly defensive whenever the moderator pressed the panelists about the inherent risks associated with private credit. What's truly astounding is that Taylor made a statement to the effect of, "We don't observe what others are doing, and we make our own investment decisions." One wonders if that's truly intended to inspire confidence. Every single time the moderator attempted to delve deeper into the risks related to private credit, the panelists would visibly clam up, with Joe Taylor frequently interjecting, almost as if attempting to prevent them from fully answering the question. By the end of the panel, the moderator had her arms crossed, and understandably so. Each attempt she made to scratch beneath the surface of the private credit market was met with resistance, if not outright hostility. In our view, this constitutes compelling evidence of systemic issues within private credit that investors and issuers are actively trying to conceal, perhaps hoping they can resolve them without a public incident. In stark contrast, the moderator of the Global Debt Panel achieved considerably greater success in eliciting substantive answers. She directly asked State Street CEO Ronald O'Hanley whether global debt had reached a tipping point, that is, a level at which debt becomes unsustainable and triggers a systemic implosion. O'Hanley, much like Zahedi when questioned about a global recession, appeared visibly uncomfortable. He conceded that while there's no tipping point yet, a crisis could indeed be on the horizon. Later, Guggenheim's CIO and Walsh articulated what many were thinking but few dared to say aloud: the pandemic stimulus effectively transferred vast amounts of private debt onto the public sector, which largely explains why governments are currently burdened with such immense debt. She elaborated that the modern monetary theory, upon which many economies now operate, posits that debt never truly needs to be paid down. Instead, it can simply be perpetually rolled over until its value is eroded by inflation. However, Walsh issued a sobering warning that this theory holds true only as long as there is no exogenous shock. The moment such a shock occurs, it becomes virtually impossible to roll over that debt, extreme governmental intervention notwithstanding. When that scenario unfolds, the inevitable consequences are widespread debt defaults, deflation, and recession. What's truly chilling is her assertion that the risks of this occurring are high in the not-too-distant future, strongly suggesting it could happen very soon. And this brings me to the fundamental question: what does all of this mean for the markets, and more importantly, for you? By this point, the answer should be quite clear. The world's elite are genuinely concerned that an exogenous shock is imminent, capable of either bursting existing market bubbles, triggering widespread debt defaults, or both. As we've observed, geopolitical risks are front and center in their minds, which is particularly vexing because they are notoriously difficult to predict. On one hand, you have scenarios like Donald Trump's tariffs, which many analysts initially believed would be the exogenous shock that would topple the global Jenga tower. Surprisingly, many panelists expressed genuine astonishment that Trump's tariffs did not, in fact, result in a global recession, and they struggled to provide a coherent explanation for why they didn't. From our perspective, it seems likely that global trade routes were simply rerouted, and the system eventually recalibrated itself. On the other hand, however, we face geopolitical shocks that would undeniably be far more impactful, such as China invading Taiwan, or even merely blockading the island. Such an event would severely disrupt chip exports, which would inevitably pop the AI bubble that has been crucial in keeping U.S. markets afloat. Since investors worldwide maintain significant exposure to U.S. stocks, the ensuing negative wealth effect could easily cascade into a global recession. There is one critical factor to keep in mind, though: exogenous shocks often produce unintended consequences. Take the war in Ukraine, for example. Some panelists noted that Russia's invasion, paradoxically, resulted in more countries joining NATO, an outcome theoretically running counter to Russia's strategic interests. Similarly, Trump's tariffs, rather than isolating China, effectively drove many countries closer to Beijing, inadvertently working against U.S. interests. It goes without saying that these exogenous shocks also generate considerable internal tensions within nations, which makes it even harder to achieve consensus and progress. This is precisely why the ideal exogenous shock for the global elite is something that appears spontaneous, such as a pandemic, which, as we now understand, likely originated from a laboratory. A crisis that can be attributed to a specific party or entity often generates counterproductive domestic and international repercussions. Consequently, the most desirable exogenous shock for the global elite at this juncture would be something like a natural disaster, an event that absolutely no one could have predicted. Such an occurrence would render it impossible to assign blame to others and could even serve as a unifying force at a time when countries are deeply divided, both internally and externally. But surely, there's no way the WEF could possibly foresee a natural disaster, could they? Whatever the case may be, if you're interested in learning more about the potential energy blackouts that could be triggered by AI, you can find our dedicated video on that topic using the link provided right here. And if you've stayed with us this far, thank you immensely for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. This is Nick. Over and out.